Objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I've got two amendments at the desk. I would ask for their immediate consideration en bloc.
The clerk will report the amendments.
The Senator from Ohio, Mr. Portman, proposes in bloc amendments numbered 6 and 7.
President, I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the amendments be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to offer first a common sense amendment to begin to address our nation's unprecedented national debt that's hurting jobs in our economy today and is placing an immoral burden on our kids and our grandkids. This is called the Dollar for Dollar Deficit Reduction Act. It ensures that every time we raise the debt limit, we cut spending by the same amount over a 10-year period. We all know the growth of the national debt is not sustainable. In the past 4 years, the national debt has risen by $6 trillion and is projected to add another $9 trillion over the next decade. These numbers are huge, too big really to comprehend, so let's put it this way. If we don't do something, we're really in trouble. Between the end of 2008 and 2022, so 9 years from now, the average household share of the national debt will have risen from $90,000 a household to $160,000 a household. That's how big the debt's gotten. Today, it's about $130,000 per household. So we know we need to do something. Democrats and Republicans alike talk about it a lot. The debt limit's an opportunity to have this debate. Future decades are, of course, going to bring even more debt. With the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan group here in Congress, now projecting that the debt will top 200% of our economy in 25 years. Again, this is unprecedented. It's about 100% of our economy right now. And by the way, those projections that it'll be 200% of our economy in 25 years, it's a pretty rosy scenario because it assumes that we'll have peace and prosperity and relatively low interest rates. I think we can all agree that saddling our children and our grandchildren with this enormous debt is not just bad economics, it is immoral. In reining in the debt, the Congressional Budget Office makes clear that spending is the driving force. When you look at the future deficits, it's spending that really is creating the major problem. According to the Congressional Budget Office, again, revenues will surpass their historic average, which is about 18% of our economy, as soon as the economy begins to recover. Spending, which has been historically 20% of our economy, has already jumped to over 23% of our economy and is projected to rise to 30, 40, 50% of GDP over the next several decades. So clearly we have a spending problem. The amendment that we've got today will ensure that the debt limit increases are matched with equal cuts in federal program spending over the next 10 years, so for a decade. There are no gimmicks, no timing shifts, but these would be real cuts in the growth of federal spending. This chart shows what the results of this would be for the country. The top lines are spending. This is the blue lines. The bottom line, the red line, is revenue. So here we are today, 2013. Again, the spending as a percent of our economy is just over 23%. If we continue to go the way we're going, what will happen is, based on these relatively rosy scenarios about our future, you'll see a dip in the spending as a percent of our economy, then it goes right back up and then quickly begins to climb further from that over coming decades. Revenues, again, under the current scenario, continue to grow to the point where they go above the historic 18%. Here it indicates that by 2022 they'd be at 19.1%. Spending, under the proposal we've got before you today, this amendment, the dollar for dollar, goes to 19.6%, so just about at the 20% historic average. This, of course, means that you're very close to balance. And it means, again, that there is a reasonable result to this, which ends up with spending being very close to the historic average, revenue coming up above its historic average, and getting us back on track toward fiscal discipline and toward fiscal sanity so that we can have a stronger economy, so that we can have the kind of robust recovery we all hope for, bring back the jobs, and so we are not leaving to our kids and grandkids such an enormous debt and deficit. We would still have a deficit here, a small one, and this would be positioning the deficit to get to balance, because it would be such a relatively small deficit compared to what we've had in the past. So if enacted, the result is about $3 trillion in savings over the next decade. This is roughly consistent with what other groups have talked about, the Simpson-Bowles Commission and others. Given the $44 trillion in spending projected over the next decade, this $3 trillion in savings should not be too much to ask. In fact, simply limiting spending growth to about 3% per year would accomplish this same result. So that's essentially what's being required here when you say there will be a dollar-for-dollar reduction in spending over 10 years every time you raise the debt limit by $1. The result is that, again, by 2022, the deficit will fall to less than 1% of GDP, very close to balance. The debt as a percent of the economy would actually be declining as well. And it actually declines to the point where, according to the Simpson-Bowles Commission and others, you would be 60-some% of the economy, which many view as having stabilized our debt. Again, got a lot of work to do even at that point, but at least it stabilizes it. It actually declines by about 19 points as a percent of the economy from where it is at its peak in terms of our debt. So future generations would be spared this crushing debt and the economic stagnation they otherwise face if Washington does nothing. Some may contend that the debt limit's the wrong place to have this spending debate. I've heard that a lot as I've been promoting this idea. I have to respectfully disagree with that. The debt limit's about all that has worked. The debt limit is not just about paying past bills. It also presents an opportunity to talk about the future. What should our bills be in the future? It's not about, as the president often says, paying our past bills. Those should be paid. It's about what bills we're going to rack up going forward. We have to make a change here. If we don't, the country is headed toward bankruptcy. Furthermore, nearly every significant deficit reduction bill over the past 28 years has been linked to the debt limit. In fact, I would say every single one of the significant deficit reduction packages in the last few decades has been linked to the debt limit. It's all that's worked around here. In 1985, there were some members who are in the Senate today who were here then. They will tell you that the Graham-Rudman-Hollings bill, which came out of the Senate, helped reduce the deficit. It was attached to what? A debt limit bill. Since that time, the three largest deficit reduction packages in the 1990s, 1990, 93, and 97, including the 1997 Balanced Budget Act, were all linked to what? A debt limit discussion. So it's really all that has worked. Statutory pay-go, which a lot of Democrats were very supportive of. That was in 2010. That came out of a debt limit discussion. Finally, of course, the debt limit was the impetus for the Budget Control Act just 2 years ago, where this Congress made a commitment to save $2.1 trillion over the decade. So just 2 years ago, we agreed to this dollar-for-dollar provision, and it was done as part of the debt limit. As we discussed the dollar-for-dollar amendment pending today, we have to remember that this is really where the idea came from. Dollar-for-dollar came out of the Budget Control Act. So for folks who attempt to label this idea as untenable, too aggressive, or without precedent, remember the dollar-for-dollar legislation passed only 2 years ago with 95 Democrat votes in the House and 45 of the 51 Democrats here in the Senate voting yes. So the idea certainly has precedent. And given the results we talked about earlier, it's a common-sense way to address the debt limit debate today and in the future, if this body is really serious about getting Washington spending and debt under control. And by the way, it wouldn't apply to this first short-term debt limit extension. This would apply to the debt limit extension that we all hope will be a longer-term agreement with Republicans and Democrats, including, as the chair and the ranking member of the Finance Committee just talked about, tax reform, entitlement reform, working together to solve these problems. This would provide the impetus to do that. So whether that's in 3 months or, as some are suggesting, 6 months from now, given the fact that Treasury will be able to use some authorities to be able to extend that debt limit, that's when this would apply. It would not apply to this short-term debt limit. But it's putting the discipline in place now that we employed only 2 years ago to be able to get real savings for our country. The debt limit's also an important tool for deficit reduction because it's all we've had. And when you think about it, we haven't had budgets. The only recent restraint came in the context of the debt limit, the dollar-for-dollar reductions in the Budget Control Act. Now, this is partly because the Senate has not passed a budget, as we all know and we've all heard about, in over 3 years. I understand the majority is committed to passing a budget here in the Senate this year. I commend them for that. I hope they will. But reconciling it with the House, of course, will be a challenge, and future years also remain uncertain. So in the absence of a budget, the fact remains that the debt limit's been the effective tool that we've used. And by the way, the fact also remains that now nearly 2/3 of all spending is not even subject to the budget. Why? Because it's on autopilot. It's not annually appropriated. It's the mandatory spending. So even if we have a budget, which I hope we do, still, the debt limit's the most likely way for us to get at the bigger picture, since 62% of spending is on autopilot or mandatory and not subject to the annual appropriations process that would be part of the budget agreement. This is why the debt limit is likely to remain the most successful tool for deficit reduction. Common sense tells us that while Washington pays its past bills, it's also got to take steps to reduce its future bills. Based on one poll that I saw, 72% of Americans agree that when you increase the debt limit, it should be matched by equal cuts, dollar for dollar. 72% of Americans. It's common sense. We did it 2 years ago. It leads us to a result that seems reasonable. Most people think we need to get spending under control. The revenues are going to go up based on the CBO projections here, and we get to virtually a balance over 10 years if we put this in place, with permitting about a 3% growth in spending every year. So this is not an unreasonable result. It's a sensible solution. Congress did it a couple years ago. I hope my colleagues will join me on a bipartisan basis to say that with regard to the longer-term debt limit extension we are facing, somewhere in the 3 to 6 month period, that we put in place this discipline and then allow the committees to do their work. We should go back to regular order. Finance Committee Chairman has made this point repeatedly, so has the ranking member. Other members have. We need hearings. We need to have an open process. We don't want these last-minute bills that people haven't had a chance to read, staff haven't had a chance to review. This would put us in that position, knowing that we have this discipline in place. We can achieve this. We must achieve this for the sake of our kids and grandkids. I urge my colleagues to support it. Mr. President, I now would like to offer a second amendment. I've been asked to offer these two amendments together. The second amendment is another idea because it doesn't have to do with the debt limit per se, but it has to do with how we avoid government shutdowns. This is bipartisan legislation, and it's a bipartisan idea who I believe whose time has come. Every year since 1997, and in all but 2 years since 1985, Congress has reached the October 1st fiscal year end without doing all the appropriations bills. Think about that. Every year since 97, we've been unable to reach agreement on all the appropriations bills, and only twice since 1985 have we ended up the fiscal year with having all the appropriations bills done. What does this result in? Well, some years there's been a relatively quick vote on what's called a continuing resolution to continue government spending in those areas where we haven't completed our work. On other years, the result has been a real showdown with the threat of a government shutdown. And then in some years, we've had an actual government shutdown. In fact, it's happened way too often. And the reason is that, again, we haven't been able to come together as Republicans and Democrats, House and the Senate, working with the President to put forward these appropriations bills in regular order. And so we face these shutdowns, and we actually have faced some last-minute budget bills, many of which, again, are full of surprises because members haven't had a chance to read it, staff have not had a chance to review it. During these shutdowns, by the way, when we've had them, it's created real problems. Americans hoping to travel abroad find their passport applications can't be processed. The Centers for Disease Control, CDC, cease disease surveillance. Recruitment of Border Control agents stop. Families planning to go on vacations to national parks find their destination is closed. It's not a good way to run a government. And I think we should avoid those shutdowns. Some make the reasonable argument that these shutdowns are an acceptable price to pay if they lead to spending cuts. Now, I understand that. That's an argument out there. But in fact, as I look at it, I think the opposite has occurred. The 1996 government shutdown that a lot of people talk about produced such a large backlash that it seemed like a lot of lawmakers decided to abandon spending restraint altogether. A proof point might be that after that 1996 shutdown, non-defense discretionary spending nearly doubled over the next decade. So it seems to me like the case for spending restraint was harmed, not helped, by the shutdown. And that last-minute budget bill that usually results from the threat of a government shutdown tends to have a lot of surprises in it. It's a real problem because over the years, Congress has found itself just hours away from a government shutdown, often forced to vote on these huge bills, 1,000-plus page bills, an omnibus spending bill that folks have not had a chance to read. Our staffs haven't sufficiently reviewed. It's not the fault of our Appropriations Committee, who do their best under tight deadlines. I think it's a fault of these artificial deadlines themselves. So with hundreds of billions of dollars at stake, we could all use more time to better understand what we're voting on. This bipartisan amendment would solve these problems. For all regular programs or activities whose appropriation bill has not been approved, whether it's all the bills or whether it's only one bill, the End Government Shutdown Act would automatically continue the current level of spending. No significant disruption, no crisis for citizens, no furloughed employees, no rush to approve a last-minute budget deal that people haven't had a chance to look at. Yet, we don't want these continuing resolutions to take the pressure off lawmakers to complete their work. So after 120 days, there would be a 1% reduction in spending. It would be across the board. In a normal year, because the new fiscal year is October 1st, this would mean lawmakers had until January 29th, well after the holiday break, to complete their work on the appropriations bills. And this year, should Washington fail to come to an agreement on what's called the continuing resolution, which comes up at the end of next month, Washington fails to do that, spending would remain at whatever the current level of spending is for those first 120 days. Under this amendment, after the 120-day period, spending levels on any remaining unfinished bills would continue to be reduced across the board 1% every 90 days. I doubt that that would be necessary because I think the appropriators, House and Senate together, would come together to solve the problems. But every 90 days there would be an additional 1% until the appropriations bills or the year-long continuing resolution has been enacted. These eventual small cuts are designed to keep both sides at the bargaining table. They aren't so small as to be irrelevant, but they're not so large as to gut any programs. Priorities of both Republicans and Democrats would be subject to the same across-the-board cuts. And both parties, therefore, would have an incentive to come to an agreement that fully funds priority programs and reduces funding for lower priorities. This bipartisan amendment may not be each lawmaker's idea of perfect. It's certainly not mine. I'd rather get all the appropriations bills done, but that's not what's happening. But we should all agree that it improves upon the current situation, where we bounce from crisis to crisis, worried about government shutdowns, as well as the rush bills we have to vote on to avoid shutdowns. The American people want us to complete our work in a logical way, and this amendment helps us to do that. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this common-sense bipartisan approach. Mr. President, I see other members are now on the floor. I yield the floor.
Senator from